All right, so I've logged into my Azure for Students, and I want to give you a quick demo of what it looks like for creating a virtual machine so that you guys can understand it for your assignment number 5. I've got the written documentation there for you guys, but it's always nice to see what's going on. So in my environment, I've got a bunch of recently accessed stuff. You're not going to see that in yours when you log in, just because you haven't been playing with things like I have. But you'll see something similar to this, right? You'll see the Azure services up top, and it'll also have some navigation stuff down below. Um, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a resource, and I'm going to create a virtual machine. Now, first thing when I'm creating a virtual machine is it wants to know what subscription this is going to be in. So I have a subscription called Byron Azure for Students. This subscription was created when I set up my Azure for Students stuff. So the way it works is the University of Manitoba has a tenant. That's kind of the big picture stuff. So, and inside that Azure tenant, when we sign up for Azure for Students, we are given a subscription inside that tenant. So each of us as individuals has subscriptions, and basically we all get our own $100 US worth of credit inside that subscription. So in my environment, I have access to more than one subscription because students have given me access as part of the assignments, but I'm just going to create it inside my own. Now, the second thing we need to do as part of setting up our virtual machines is we need to create something called a resource group. Resource groups are important because items that we create are can be shared within a resource group, but not between resource groups. So, for example, if I create a network address inside of one resource group and a virtual machine inside the other, that address cannot be used by the virtual machine. Everything needs to be created inside the same resource group. So to make my life easy, I'm just going to create a resource group called Byron A5, and that'll be easily identifiable to me. Next up, I want to give my virtual machine a name. So this is going to be my server. So I'm going to call it Byron A5 server. Again, just blindingly obvious, makes life easy. We can pick what region we want to put stuff in. US East, US West. I would recommend against the Asia, Europe, Africa stuff because it's just a long way away from us. So I tend to stick with US East just because it's easy. And the availability zone, separate your resources within a region. Yeah, we don't need to. We're going to go with the lowest level, which is availability zone. And zone options, we'll just leave it at the default of self-selected zone, and we'll leave it as zone 1. So again, just the idea, some of your resources need to be created in the same zone in order to be accessible. So I'm just going to leave everything in zone 1. Security type, trusted launch, that's fine, that's a good default. So the image we want to use, the image defines which operating system we're using. So there's a whole bunch of them that we can choose from. If you click on see all images, there's many different images. But basically, images are pre-installed operating systems that are ready for us. So I am just going to click back and hope that it takes me back to my previous screen. I'm going to say no. So I'm going to go with Windows Server here. And I'm going to do Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition Hot Patch Gen 2. Honestly, from our perspective, just about everything could work. Actually, you know what? I'm even going to go with small disk so that uses up a little less storage space. And I want an x64, which is normal Intel processor type of stuff, rather than the ARM64, which is low power processors, which I don't need to play with at this point. Run with Azure Spot Discount just means that gives us some options for saving money. So I'm going to leave that off because I want to run it when I want to run it, but it is a way to save a little bit of cash. The size of our virtual machine. So this is letting us select how much memory we're going to have, and how much processing power we're going to have. So my experience has been that we need to have at least 2 virtual CPUs to run Windows Server 2022, and we also need to have 4 gigs of memory to run the server side stuff. There are free virtual machines that we can do with 1 virtual CPU and 1 gig of memory, but they do not adequately run the graphical interface. And I'm just going to double check my yeah, they're not specifying, so I'm just going to assume that that includes the graphical interface. So the one I'm going to pick here is this standard B2 ALS V2 with 2 virtual CPUs, 4 gigs of memory, $34 US a month. Now that 34 US a month is only charged to us while the machine is up and running. So for most of the time, we're going to be able to shut down the virtual machine, and we're probably only going to spend maybe 8 hours playing with it while it's up and alive and running. So it won't actually use that much money for us. When it creates the virtual machine and it has the operating system needs to be configured with an administrative user. So I'm choosing to call mine local admin. You can choose to call yours whatever you want. Just make sure you keep track of it. The password, again, you can make your password whatever you want. These machines, the way we're going to set them up from a network perspective is they're going to be accessible from the internet. So make sure that the passwords that you give your users are actually strong passwords that are able to be or not easily guessed, right? So do the 10 characters, uppercase, lowercase. Even though the resources to us are not critical, you still don't want someone doing random scans on the internet and getting access to your stuff. So I'm just using a password I've used before. For public, we are going to allow select inbound ports, remote desktop protocol port 3389. That's how we're going to be able to remote control these virtual machines. Again, from a real world perspective, I would not normally want to do that. You can actually set this whole thing up so that you can access it through a VPN instead. This is just a little bit easier for you guys to get started with. And notice that there is a note here that inbound traffic from the internet is going to be blocked by default, and we need to change inbound port rules on the VM networking page. So that is going to be in addition to this. So that's that's kind of the high level virtual machine config. Click next to go to our disk configuration. Sure, let's see what the recommendations are. So it is suggesting that East US and Zone 3 would be better. And I don't really care where it's located. So, sure, I will adopt the suggestion. So I'm going to be in East US 2 instead, and in Zone 3 instead. So for whatever reason in the background, they have got something going on that says that's a better way to go, so I'm just going to trust them. From a real world perspective, if I already had all my other stuff in the regular East one, I would leave it there. I wouldn't be picking a different data center just for kicks. All right, so over to the disk stuff. So the operating system disk size, 30 gigs is the default. And that's just basically enough to get the operating system up and running. We're not doing much, so that 30 gigs should be fine. Now the OS disk type, I am going to change this to be standard hard drive. And standard hard drive is slow, but it's cheap. And the reason I spent $3 on that other virtual machine was it wasn't using standard hard drive. So we're just going to use standard hard drive. Because what we are doing, if I have to wait a minute for my virtual machine to start up instead of it starting a little bit faster, I'm okay with that. Anything else here that matters? We don't need to add a separate data disk. We will or you will, as part of activity number 5, be creating a file system structure. But that file system structure can be done on the C drive. We're not going to worry about adding additional data disks. From a real world perspective, you tend to keep the data on your virtual servers on a different drive letter than the operating system. Just makes management a little bit easier. I'm just going to check and see what we've got for advanced. So it's using managed disks. These aren't options we really can do anything with because we're using the basic disk type. Okay, kick it over to networking. On the networking side, it's going to create a subnet for us. So the subnet mine is creating by default. So, because again, inside our subscription and inside our resource group, we are creating a whole little virtual networking environment. So the default subnet that it's creating for me is 10.0.0.0/24. So if you remember from class, /24 is the CIDR notation that identifies that the network is or the subnet mask is 255.255.255.0, and in that case, the network name is 10.0.0. So anything that starts 10.0.0 is going to be on the same network for us if we stick with this default. We could, if we wanted to, create a different one, but that's what it's going to create by default. It's also going to create a public IP address for us by default. We could turn that off, but we do want a public IP address. Otherwise, we can't do the remote control. So the network security, I'm going to leave that as basic. Public inbound ports is going to allow port 3389. And that should be fine. So I believe the type of IP address that it's creating. Actually, you know what? I'm going to create a new one on my own instead. Let's do this. Create new. And when I create new, it isn't giving me the option to create basic. So standard charges me 5 cents per hour for it being alive, or half a cent per hour. I can't remember. Works out to $5 a month for the IP address. So I will leave it here. If we don't include it here and we create it later on, then we can create the ones that are free, but that just seems silly at this point. So, okay, I'll just let it go with its own settings. Anything here? No, we don't need load balancing. So click next. None of this management stuff we really care about. So what's auto shutdown? Yeah, let's turn that on, see if it'll let us. So I'm going to say that at 1 a.m. I want my virtual machine to automatically shut down, and I want that to be central time. So that should be UTC -5 or so right now. -6. There we go. And notification before shutdown, sure. And I'm not going to worry about backups because this isn't the real world. We'll let it do its hot patching, which means it will do its updates, and we'll let it reboot after the updates if required. Diagnostics, alerts, we don't care about any of this stuff for our purposes. And as you can guess, anything that's on an advanced tab, we probably don't care about anything on the advanced tab for us in this particular zone. Tags are something you can set up on resources so that you can organize the resources. Again, we don't need to worry about that. So I'm going to do a review here. And our RDP port open to the internet. It's just warning us that this is a bad idea, and that's fine. And it's telling us that it's going to charge us 5 cents per hour to run our virtual machine. So good to go. Going to create that guy. And basically it does all of the bits and pieces in the background now so that we can actually access this. So deployment is in progress. We'll just watch this finish up. And then I'll show you how to get connected to it. So it created the bits and pieces, created network security group, created the public IP address, created our virtual network, created our network interface. Then it's creating the virtual machine that's going to be attached to all that stuff. So things are not instantaneous when you create these virtual machines, but it's only a few minutes, certainly much faster than the old days when you had to order in physical hardware. And the main difference doing it in the cloud like we're doing is we don't need to understand any of the back-end physical infrastructure. We're just saying create the virtual machine and it's good to go. All right, so our VM is there and we've got the option, go to resource. Let's see that it exists. So it's complaining about the agent status not ready. Again, that's a monitoring thing. We really don't care about that. But you can go and review your other settings. So for example, our public IP address, or mine as the case may be, the public IP address assigned to this is 2049.52.153. So that is the IP address I would use to actually connect to this virtual machine. So the virtual machine is already started. We can tell that because it's grayed out. Anything else? So we can review all of what we've done. But yeah, I think that's all you need to know about the initial setup. So in terms of connecting, I'm just going to click on connect here and let's see what we get. So this takes us to the connection screen, and normally the way we want to connect to it is by using this using remote desktop protocol. They do have other methods. So they mention we can do this bastion host thing and some other connectivity methods, but this is the typical way we're going to do it. Notice for port 3389, we've got this option to check access to that IP address. So let's see if that works. And it tells me it's accessible. So that means that all my firewall stuff actually was automatically configured, and I don't need to worry about anything else. I can do a remote desktop into this guy. So next up, I want to show you how to connect to your virtual machine that you've got set up. You can see I've got some software here named Remote Desktop Connection. This is built into Windows 10, Windows 11. It is also available for a Mac if you want to use a Mac for doing your remote control. So you can see that for this, I've entered in the IP address that they gave me for the public IP address of my server virtual machine. I'm not entering in the port number because the port number 3389 is the default for remote desktop protocol. This is my remote desktop protocol client. So I don't need to enter that in, just kind of like the way when you use a web browser, HTTPS, you don't need to enter in port 443. Notice that the username I'm connecting with is also local admin. That's again matching the username that we created when we created the virtual machine. So I'm going to connect. And when I do that, it's popping up and asking me for a password. Depending on the configuration of your computer, you might need to select this more choices option in order to get to the point where you can put in a username and password. So just be aware of that. Then I'm going to click OK to connect. And then it's going to pop up and it gives me a certificate error. So the certificate error that it's giving me is because it's a self-signed certificate that's generated by the server and my computer doesn't trust it. So I know this is legitimate. So even though it's flagging this as a potential security warning, I'm going to say that I want to connect anyway. Later on in the course, we'll talk more about certificates. So now it is connecting. I just need to get my window in the right spot so you guys can see what's going on. And this is my Windows virtual machine. So it's going to pop up with this Azure Arc thing. We don't care about that. And if I click on local server, this, if you've already watched the demonstration video of configuring Windows, you've kind of seen this interface before, and it has info on how to go through and add server roles and stuff like that. But at this point, we've got a functional virtual machine up and running that we can start to do configuration on. So notice that it already is named exactly what we named it when we created the virtual machine. So when you create your virtual machine, that is the computer name it's going to have. So make sure you select accordingly. The other thing to be aware of is the IP address is assigned by DHCP. And in the video that talks about domain configuration, it mentions that we want to have a static IP address. And in fact, we do want to have a static IP address. However, the static IP address cannot be set by going into the properties of Ethernet here. We do not want to set it from inside the virtual machine. One of the critical things with static IP addresses and in Azure AD Connect, sorry, not Azure AD Connect, in Azure with virtual machines, is we need to configure that from the web interface for Azure. So I'm going to minimize this window and go back to this window. And in this window here, if I go to my virtual machine, so here I'm just going to go back to home. I'm going to go back to my virtual machine, and I'm going to go to my network settings. And I do have a document that I uploaded for you guys. So in my network settings, you can see my public IP address. I can also go to my network interface. And in my network interface, I've got properties, and it's got my IP configuration. So we can see that my private IP address, so my address that's coming from that 10.0.0 network, is dynamic. And right now it's been given 10.0.0.4. So our server, we want it to have a static private IP address. So we want to actually edit that and change it. So if I go to IP configurations and I go to my IP config, we can see my private IP address setting is dynamic. I want to change it to static. And when I change it to static, it's automatically selecting the address that I had before. So I can pick any address that is on our subnet. So anything that starts 10.0.0.0 is good. So if I want to make this easy on myself, I can make it 10.0.0.10 and save. And it might disconnect me in RDP when I do that. So I'm just going to bring my RDP window back up. And it has in fact disconnected me because it's no longer on that IP address. And I might need to do a shutdown and a restart in order for that to properly reconnect. So basically what's happening right now is our public IP address is mapped to the private IP address. I changed the private IP address because I thought I was being smart, and I created a problem for myself. So if I restart the virtual machine, it should redo the mapping. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to minimize this, and I'm going to go back here. And I'm going to go back to my virtual machine overview. And no, I don't want network settings. So A5 server, overview. And I want to do restart on my virtual machine. Yes. So I'm hoping now that when it does a restart, everything is going to sync back up. So the simplest thing to do would have been to keep the same IP address it already had, the 10.0.0.4, and then I would have been okay. All right, so I'm hoping it's had time to restart. I'm going to try and connect again. If it doesn't respond immediately, that just means it's not connecting the way I hoped. Oh, there we go. Came up enough to ask me for the password. Give it the password. Connect again. Yes to the certificate. And I'm in. So when you change the IP address, that is the interface you need to do it in. So only your server needs to be set for a static address. The client machine does not need to be set for a static address. And we can cancel that. Wait for Server Manager to come up, and I'll show you for sure that it did change its IP address to 10.0.0.10. I do not know what that error was, and for our purposes, it doesn't matter. Close this. Go to local server. And we can see it's still IPv4 address assigned by DHCP. But if I do a command prompt, actually I don't need to do command prompt. I'll right click the start menu and I'm going to open up Windows PowerShell prompt. Which is kind of an advanced command line sort of thing. And if I do ipconfig, we can see that I'm now using 10.0.0.10. So basically what happens there is whatever IP configuration we do in the web-based interface, that is going to get pushed out via DHCP to the server. So it's automatically using 10.0.0.1 as its gateway. If I do /all, we can see, where's our DNS servers? DNS server it's using is 168.63.129.16. So that's one of Microsoft's DNS servers. So that's another thing we're going to need to update because we want our server to use itself for DNS when we've got the whole Active Directory thing installed. And we also want our client to use our server for DNS when Active Directory is installed. So I will again minimize my remote control window here. And if we go back into my network settings for my server, and if we go back to my IP settings, so I'll hit network interface and configure our IPs, go into ipconfig 1. So that's the addresses. Oh, sorry, my mistake. I went in the wrong spot. DNS servers. There we go. So we can inherit them from the virtual network, which is what it's doing right now by default, or we want it to point at itself. So I'm going to say 10.0.0.4. Sorry, 4 was the old address, 10. So that means it's going to talk to itself for DNS, and that's what we want for our whole Active Directory setup. So I will save that. And it warns us that it might restart the virtual machine. Nice. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to go back to my remote control window and I'm going to do an ipconfig /renew, which forces it to get new DHCP information, and we'll see if it picks up the DNS server automatically. And view, and you can see my DNS server was updated. So again, configure it in the web, gets pushed out to your virtual machine by DHCP. So a little bit different than what would happen in a regular virtual machine environment or in kind of with physical servers. But that's it, and that should be enough to get you guys going on your assignment.